you all had an opportunity to go through the psychological tests. It did not take a lot of time, but I think it really helps in your insight of our conversation this evening. So with that, Loredana, could you share with us?
I will bring my chair over a little closer. Hi, everybody. Really nice to meet you. I want to give you a little background on the Myers-Briggs personality preferences that you had an opportunity to experience. It's actually, you're looking at a hybrid version. The link that we provided you from California Lutheran University is a hybrid Myers-Briggs personality assessment. Currently, to do the full test, it's quite lengthy, quite complex, and you need to be reviewed by a certified practitioner. In other words, they're very, very touchy about the use of Myers-Briggs information. This, in 44 questions, is a great sort of a shortcut to all the information. I took the original Myers-Briggs maybe 30 years ago, and this 44-question assessment gave me exactly the same results. Interestingly, we were talking with our career services director today, and she had pointed out to me that Myers-Briggs personality preferences tend to hold over time. So unless you have some sort of traumatic event in your life, you probably had these same preferences when you were quite a bit younger than you are today, and you will continue with them. It doesn't mean that you can't learn to be effective in dealing with all types of people. And I would like to just point that out, that what you are doesn't mean you can't sort of mutate and you learn to use all of the modalities. So I would just like to start out by asking you if you thought that the results spoke to you in any way, if there was anything valuable in finding out what your type was. Okay, that's really interesting. So there were some things that held consistent. And again, it would have to be the exact profile assessment that would hold consistent. You know, you can take different sort of smatterings of tests like this. And part of the reason that I wanted to introduce this was that it's an easy handle. And it gives you some tools that you can immediately start to use in dealing with other people, especially people that you perceive that you're having difficulty talking to. Maybe let's just widen the lens a little bit and ask people. I think everybody has some difficult communication that they have to do. It could be not even in your business. It could just be in your family or in your neighborhood or in your work life. But has everybody had the experience of feeling at odds in their communication style with another person? It tends to be the people that we are the more similar to, the time will fly. In other words, if you're in an hour consult with a client who has a similar preference to yours, that time's just going to fly by. In fact, you usually end up going a little overtime, or you feel really excited about the exchange. You know it's going really well. Other times when it's not, the time seems to drag on forever, and that's a big clue that you have different communication styles. We don't advocate giving the test to your clients. I mean, in a really serious, you're not attempting to educate them. You're not attempting to find out what their personality type is. What starts to happen is when you analyze people that you have regular conversations with, you can think it through, and you are going to have a way of comparing them to you, basically, so that if you know that you're an introvert or an extrovert, and you see the people that you have difficulty with, you can judge the degree of extroversion and introversion. And in fact, really, in very few people are they 100%, right? You know, you can come across as an extrovert, but you know, you could be very close to the line of an introvert, just like Michael said that he had a borderline between sensing and intuitive. That can be very useful, by the way, to be on the borderline. I'd like to point that out to you, Michael, is that being on the borderline gives you access to both. And it means that it's not going to be super hard for you to modify your communication style, no matter what your client's preference is. It's going to be a very easy switch to you. You know, you're just going to sort of go a little to the left, a little to the right. And really very few people are pure completely of one or the other. I think understanding these preferences and being able to judge and I use the word judge without meaning a bad or good thing. A lot of people think that judgment means we're making a statement and a judgmental type decision that would literally be condemning of somebody. And there's no judgment in the judging style. The judging person is decisive and orderly and plans and likes to have an agenda. So the perceiving people are more adaptable and flexible and process new information, but nobody's judgmental, okay? Those words are a little unfortunate, is that nobody is actually harsh and judgmental. It's really just an orientation for how orderly you like the conversation to flow. Some people go into a client meeting with a list of 10 topics that they're going to cover in that hour. And then they encounter the perceptive client who doesn't want to go through all 10, and they just want to spend the entire hour on just one. And that could be okay, it could be great, but the person who's got the list of 10 things in front of them gets a little nervous and they get a little anxious because they're not making the headway in their list that they would like to feel successful. So sometimes it's just letting go. It's just understanding that you're not always going to get your way. And if the client is hampering you and not allowing the meeting to go as you planned, you have to make a determination. Are you going to push them through and make sure you get to all your 10 points by keeping them silent, or are you going to use the opportunity to listen? Neither is bad or good. It's just going to be what's going to work for the lifestyle, not even the lifestyle, for the time that you're going to spend with that client. How many meetings are you going to have? Are you having 3 meetings or 10 meetings? Are you going to be meeting with them over the rest of their life? Or in 2 weeks, are you expected to give them back a whole data plan? So it really depends on everything. It depends on how you're going to use this information and how long you think you're going to know this person. That's the other thing. Did anybody else have any feelings or thoughts about the actual test itself and if it matched up to their own personal view of themselves? To me, the sensing intuiting one is something that until I took the test 30 years ago, I had never even thought about. And I'd like you to just sort of think about that for a second. The sensors, the people who score high on the sensing index, they are the people who exist to get things done. Often, even in their choice of occupations, they're people who they thrive on real-time experiences. They don't like to wool gather or to sit around thinking about things. They like to do things. And they're great for organizations. And you can be a financial planner and have any of these preferences. So you will have financial planners that are super high on the sensor scale, and they rate themselves by, how many clients they've seen and how much they have metrics. They like to rate themselves on metrics, and they like to see things happening and getting things done. Intuition doesn't mean that the person is a psychic. I just wanted to point that out. Okay, it doesn't mean that the person only exists in their gut or their intuition. It just means that they like to step back and look at the big picture, and that they look at future applications of little tiny pieces of information that they gather from people, and they put them all together like a jigsaw puzzle. They're the ones who almost seem to solve problems magically, but there really is not magic involved at all. They just have accumulated a lot of data, and at a certain point they just spit out the answer. And it might be a year later. I'm not saying that they're going to do it that minute. But that sensor intuitor, you don't realize how much at odds you can be with somebody who has a completely different way of gathering information. So to me, that's a really interesting preference to think about when you do take the test. Where do you fall on that sensing intuitive continuum? And again, nobody's going to be all 100% one or all 100% the other. And the other thing is to surround yourself with people that are complementary. So if you're not an intuitor, or if you're a solo practitioner, how are you going to get that big picture? How are you going to get that ability to solve future problems? You're going to want to have people either in some sort of practice group that you meet with, or a mentor, or somebody who can help you to step back. Likewise, if you're overly intuitive and you're not so strong on the sensing you're going to need somebody to keep you on track, because sometimes you're going to wool gather, and sometimes you're going to be thinking of things that aren't taking place today. So it's really a matter of balance. It's really an exciting way to leverage your strengths and to build a team that's going to make the most of all of these things. Thinking and feeling. How many of the people who took the test, how many people scored high on thinking? Can you just sort of tell me? Interesting. That is so super, super interesting, Jared. That was really exciting to me that that's how you tested out. And the way that you can use that information is still by studying what those words mean and understanding that you have the ability to go both ways, which is very special. And for you to do that in all three areas, it sounds like you're probably a very even keel person, and that this is going to make your communication with a wide variety of people less problematic. So that is by far not a bad thing. And just understanding it and understanding what that means to you and how you relate to others. You can see probably the people that you would have the most problem with would be people who are not even keel at all, but people who are very slanted in one way or another. In other words, if you had a client that was, super off the chart extroversion, super off the chart sensing, and then super off the chart feeling, so they were kind of all over the place. And then, you're more in the middle. How does that sound? Well, remember that this test is their continua. So they're not trying to label you in a specific way. And also what's interesting about this test is that with the 16 different personality types, right? So it's not that you're either an extrovert or an introvert. You're going to be some combination of the four. And that makes it 16 different types is a lot more exacting than just, one or the other. The thinking and feeling thing, a lot of times people do think it means touchy-feely, and it really doesn't. It just means that in your communication, your preference is for there to be harmony and for there to be not conflict. And so sometimes people who score high on the feeling index they won't have conflict. They'll avoid conflict. They'll do anything to avoid conflict. And that can lead to some pretty bad decisions. Likewise, a person who scores super high on the thinking can hurt people's feelings all the time without even trying to. When I used this, I was a human resource manager, and when I used this was in management training. I would have an employee in my office crying that they were going to quit and telling me it was because their manager hated them. And I knew perfectly well the manager didn't hate them. I knew that the manager talked in a certain way. The manager happened to be a thinker sensor. So if the employee wasn't working fast enough, they'd practically kick them and say, work faster, get this done. It was a printing business, and there was a lot of time-sensitive things. And if I had employees that were higher on the feeling index, they couldn't accept that message in that way. It hurt them. And so they wanted to run away from that thinker sensor person. So it's really expensive to keep recruiting employees, and I finally had to use the Myers-Briggs system to teach the managers about their own personality and their own profiles. And we didn't give each employee a personality preference. We had too many employees. We had over 100 and something employees at that time. We couldn't give it all to them, but we would say, what do we think that employee is, And the people who didn't like the thinker sensor, they usually were feelers. And if we could talk about communication and about the fact that it wasn't personal, that the manager certainly did not hate the employee. The word hate was just such a strong word, the manager was shocked. What do you mean? I don't hate that. I don't hate anybody. I certainly don't hate that person. Why do they think I hate them? Well, because their communication profiles were so different, and the feeler just wanted to get away from that. So if you were a super off the chart thinker, you need to rethink how that might appear, and it's just really helpful for you to stop at a certain point and think about how are you perceived? How do people perceive your communication style? But but coming in dead even on 3 areas tells me that you could probably deal with a very wide range of people and be able to communicate just fine. You're not going to have huge gaps of problems. And over time, you can think about that as you're dealing with people. It's almost sort of a little mental exercise you can go through over the next week or so is, who do I have problems with? Who am I not feeling that level of comfort and that ease of communications where the things just flow and time just melts and it's all good? Where do you feel that sort of tension? Like, oh, this isn't going well. I will tell you that people tend to marry opposites, which can be really interesting. You can also use all of these things in your personal life, in your family, in your neighborhood. Think about it. The way to really start to understand it is to sort of apply it to all sorts of people that you know. I'm a very interesting combination because I'm an extrovert, intuitive, feeler, perceiver. And my husband is the exact opposite. And as they all say, opposites attract, right? And it's really hard sometimes for us to communicate because I don't like the way that sensor thinkers communicate a lot. And he has no perception. He doesn't even perceive what an intuitive feeler is talking about. So I have to use very careful language to talk to him. I have other family members that are a lot like me, and it's all good. And then some of my in-laws are really difficult, not surprisingly. I won't say that Myers-Briggs is genetic. I will not say that, and I don't think anybody would say that. But I think you learn from how you're raised as a child. And one of the messages of today that you get from the money scripts and from the therapeutic and counseling techniques and a little bit from this is that you sort of have to step back and take the whole person into account, not just the person sitting in front of you, but the child who was raised by these other people. My father is Italian. He grew up during World War II. His family lost all of their money, and he lost his father in the war. And my grandmother, who had never worked a day of her life, had to go to work as a secretary. First, before she did that, she had to sell every valuable thing in the family, including their jewelry, to feed them, to feed her 2 children. So my father has a very strange relationship with money, which is that he always refused to save it because he thought he was going to die tomorrow because he had seen life end really quickly. And he's never been able to work with a financial planner. I wonder why. He was never even willing to work with a financial planner. He was never even willing to talk about money. And in listening to all of the material that you're talking about here, if he were to sit down with any of you, he probably wouldn't even tell you his story. You wouldn't be able to drag it out of him. So it's almost unfair. You're working with something, and sometimes you can't see what's behind that person's inability to deal with money. But so often it's going to come from their childhood and from their parents and even their grandparents. And world events, we have the children who were the Great Depression children, people who lived through World War II, immigrants, people who came from other countries and lived through extreme conflict. Some of those things are low-hanging fruit and you'll get them right away. This personality piece, it's pretty low-hanging too. Once you get used to it, you'll pretty much know very quickly. You can sort of tell who's an extrovert and who's an introvert. And people know. It is not something that's going to impact your good clients, but it's a skill that when you get to those hours where you're just like almost dreading talking to somebody, that's when you want to come back and say, where could I adjust a slight amount to make this conversation go better or to get more through to the client? Just like we said earlier about the doctor and the diabetes, that doctor was probably a sensor thinker, and they can't understand what a feeler is going to run away from them. So once you start to be able to take apart these little things, you can be more effective with the clients that you have. Being more effective also brings you more clients because, as you know, referrals are hugely important in practice businesses. So if a client is going to tell somebody about you and they're going to say that this person is a great communicator or that they really care or they really listen, that's going to be a great thing. It's going to come back to you again in the form of a referral. doesn't mean that each person that you're referred to, you have to treat exactly the same way, but it means that once you're good at communicating, you get known for that, and I think it's a very positive thing.
Loredana, if I could ask you a question here.
Yes.
We talked before about adapting.
Right.
Because my aha from this was really, again, it brought into my mind the range of personalities.
Right.
And that's fine. It just helped me understand, oh my goodness, maybe I am in one camp or the other. We talked about how do you remain authentic, who you are. And you said to me, you don't change who you are,
no, you
the way you
do.
communicate. But you also said you can adapt, you can fine-tune it so you can better relate. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. That's something that comes with practice, and that comes, I think, with having jobs where you're dealing always with new people, and really your whole day is spent with people. You get very good at understanding that communication is the key to your mental health, and you're going to have better life if you can communicate with a wider variety of people. You do always want to remain yourself. If you're an introvert, this doesn't mean that when you're with an extrovert, you should act in an extroverted way. What it means is that you understand your need to protect yourself as an introvert. Extroverts tend to get energy from social interactions, whereas for introverts, social interactions actually feel like they cause you to require alone time in reciprocal measures so that you can build yourself back up. So it's a little bit different. If you are an introvert and you're dealing with an extrovert, you might want to buffer that with just a little bit more time in between that and your next client, if possible, or layering clients in such a way that you don't have all your extroverts in one day if you're an introvert, because that's going to tire you out. The way introverts have explained it to me is that they sometimes feel like extroverts are sucking the life out of them. So that's just something to be aware of. Whereas extroverts tend to thrive on all that, and they can go into a very crowded social setting, and it's like giving them fuel. They love to keep going. They can plan their days in different ways. Again, even with the thinking and feeling dichotomy, if you're a feeling person, very, very high on the feeler score, it doesn't mean you're going to ever not be that. You're always going to be that. But when you're dealing with a thinker, you might have to use different types of words. You have to listen to yourself. I tend to talk a lot about how I feel, even without intending to. I'll say, well, I feel that you're really trying your best there, and I feel like you're really doing a great job. And maybe it's even just changing the word feel to think. Little things like that, little cues like that. Maybe it's a matter of, if you're dealing with a thinking client, even if it's not your strong suit, giving them a more logical and objective analysis in writing. Maybe it's never going to come in your verbal communication. Maybe you're always going to not do that. Or vice versa. If you're a very, very heavy-duty thinker and your client's a heavy-duty feeler, you're going to have to talk to them more. Just knowing that you're going to have to maybe spend a little bit more time to bring that harmony to them. Maybe it's a matter of 5 minutes, and you think you're wasting it, but it's actually like money in the bank to them, because it's causing them to feel more heard and more trusted. So these are the little sorts of things that I'm talking about, that they don't require you changing anything about yourself. You always want to be your authentic self. And neither myself nor anybody that in the psychological world is ever going to tell you, no, mold yourself completely differently and change. There are people who work in the imitation mold, so that if they are an introvert but they're with an extrovert, they'll try to amp up their energy a little bit so that they can match the client's energy. I don't know that that's really possible. I don't know what I feel about that, because I think it's very hard to be not true to yourself. You can't, it's like a leopard and its spots. I mean, if you're an introvert, you're an introvert. I think it's pretty hard to play an extroverted role. Now, if you're one of those people who are in the middle, and you can go either way, great. You can match the client's style a little bit more and make them a little bit more comfortable. But that's because it's authentic for you. You really can feel comfortable in either world.
That's really fascinating. Let us stop for a second and give the microphone to you. Any thoughts from you, or even questions for Loredana related to the personality preferences?
And this isn't about tricking people, and it isn't about being inauthentic. But if what you want them to do is something that they don't want to do, you have to lead them into it backwards. It's really becoming very aware of psychology and very aware of motivation and very aware of why people do what they do. So you might want the client to do something that they don't want to do, and to you the most time-effective way is just to tell them what you want them to do and then expect them to do it. But if you already know they don't want to do it, you know, if they don't do it, what's going to happen? You know, there can be some serious doom and gloom things that happen if they don't do what you tell them, right? You know, they could lose their house. They could not have enough money for retirement. They could not have enough money to pass down to their children. There are some pretty serious consequences of it. But you might have to take more time than you originally thought, and you might have to change the words or the order of the words. And you also might have to ask them a lot more questions that lead them to the conclusion that you want them to come to. I think that's part of the problem with doctors, is that they only have maybe 5 minutes with you, and so they don't feel that they have time to lead you through this sort of maze where you're going to come out the other side saying what they're saying with questioning. I think questioning is one of the best tools that you have, and just awareness of the personality preferences. So if you have somebody who's who you think, or you're pretty sure they're a high-level feeler and high-level perceiver, you know, if you come in with your thinking, judging self and tell them that in 10 minutes this is how it's going to be, now, I don't know how much compliance you're going to get. You know, you can try that and see how it works for you. I think you're going to probably do way better if you spend a little bit more time with them, and maybe they're going to have to come back a few more times than you would even like to talk more through things and to get to the root of why they're not willing to comply.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Yeah,
Jerry, absolutely. The clients are in charge of their plan, and they decide whether or not they do things, and we make recommendations. I always think showing them or talking to them about the consequences of action or inaction related to a prioritized goal can in fact get that conversation aligned a little bit. If you recall that one pre-recorded lecture where I share an interview with Audrey Jones, and she shares when someone comes in and says something like, you know, I decided I want to spend this money rather than saving, and she'll say, that's fine, but let's look at what we'd have to do then to reach your goal. Would you be willing to work an extra 3 years? Would you do to bring it back into their camp? Because you're absolutely right. We're not going to make them do anything they don't want to do. Like you said, you may take more time to work back in. But good question.
Really good question.
Okay, Loredana, the curveball. You said this evening, I think even Graham pointed out, that when your preferences align with the client, the conversation flows. The time just flows.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. We get into our meetings with the husband and wife, the life partners. We connect with one, we don't connect with the other. Like you said, opposite attract, right? Yeah. But we know we have to connect with that other person, because we also realize that like 7 or 8 widows will end up leaving when the husband dies because that connection was never made. Right. What do we do in a meeting when we have a couple, we're connecting with one, we're not, so we want to try to adapt? How do we kind of match the two or integrate the two?
I think that if you're Michael, you're going to be really lucky, because what you almost have to do is move a little bit to the middle. I think if you can move a little bit to the middle, if you have opposites in that couple, that moving to the middle will cause them to move a little bit more to the middle as well. It's a very difficult situation. However, I think it's a very normal situation. From my life experience, very, very often couples are opposite. And you know, sometimes you get the 2 peas in a pod. You know, you get your couple in there, and they're like little replicas of each other. And the way that they talk to each other, you know, you can tell that they've lived together so long that they've picked up each other's traits. They finish each other's sentences, and that's easier. But you know, there are some often volatile and even cross-cultural issues that can come up in marriages where you have somebody from one culture married to somebody from another culture, and they have completely different personalities, as well as completely different money scripts, as well as completely different ways of handling money. So that is a very difficult situation, and you're going to use all of your skills to pull that out.
Thank you. I'm going to move to this right here, and this was the financial DNA. Some of you in the business may have already attended some of these workshops where you heard this idea of we can take information about the lifestyle, the choices of an individual, and kind of how we can frame our meetings. An interesting piece of this, when I first showed it to you, you looked at it and you said, well, that's just Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
Could you explain that a little, what you said?
Well, when Harry showed this to me, it was just clear where they had gotten this. It's like the DNA of this is Myers-Briggs. And again, I'm telling you, for 50 years, that's pretty much been just the norm in any field that did any dissection of personality types. This, of course, has translated the Myers-Briggs straight into financial planning, right? So it's looking at why you need Myers-Briggs. It's telling you what you can do with it. And they really just translate the words into your world.